IVM.
Netflix has hit the ball out of the park once again. Their new show, When They See Us, is a global hit. It's won 11 Emmy nominations. And social media is abuzz with all the conversation about what happened in the events that the show has depicted. This is Mr. and Mrs. Binge-Watch. I'm Aniruddha and I'm sitting here with my better half, Janice.
Hi!
And we've just finished binge-watching the show over the weekend. In fact, we had Purna Jagannathan in our studios a couple of weeks ago and she heavily recommended the show to us. And it's not like we would not have watched it because Ava DuVernay directing the show now, I mean, her filmography has been impeccable so far,
Yeah,
right?
it speaks for itself.
And I'm a huge fan of Selma when it came out. In fact, I remember that Oscar year when the film got nominated. I was extremely excited to see it at least get a couple of wins, but I don't think it ended up winning because it had really strong competition. And then she went on to make The 13th, right? Which was a documentary.
Another
which was
Oscar-nominated
again
documentary.
nominated at the Academy Awards. So she's got this amazing filmography. A lot of her movies, a lot of her content, a lot of her stories are focusing on the African American community. She takes up issues that are close to the community. She talks about the hardships that African Americans have faced in the United States over a period of time. And the When They See Us trailer was something that Janice and I, took to quite easily. But for some reason, we didn't get around to watching it till this weekend. And we just finished it. And it's a really, really powerful piece of storytelling.
Actually, I want to get into why we didn't watch it for as long as we did, because generally you and I are the kind of people, like, if we see a trailer that excites us, and especially when it comes, with the kind of names that are attached to this project, we generally are the first ones to say, chalo,
weekend sorted.
Put all plans aside. This is what we're doing on this weekend. But I think what happened with When They See Us is that as soon as it came out, the reactions to the show was so extreme in a very positive way, but also with a lot of writers saying that this show is not an easy watch. This show will sort of depress you, make you feel sad, make you really think. And I don't know, for some reason, I think you and I were not in that state of mind where we just wanted to get into something like that. Like, you remember, we kept looking for lighter watches. Maybe because we're also maybe busy in our own professional lives right now.
Yeah.
We just kept putting this off. And like you said, once Purna came in and when she was talking about, a show that we asked her about, what is a show that's really moved you, really compelled you to think and to, rethink your circumstances. And she recommended When They See Us so highly. And she just said, stop putting it off, stop procrastinating, just go home and start watching. That's pretty much what we did this weekend.
Yeah, but more than that, I think for me also, then the Emmy nominations came
Correct,
out.
yeah.
And it features really heavily in the limited series category, in almost all of the limited series categories.
Right.
It's got a director nomination for DuVernay. It's got the best limited series nomination alongside Chernobyl. And
it's got a lot of acting nominations.
And a couple of others. And I mean, it's got a bunch of acting nominations because it's of a really, really high standard.
Right.
But I must say that, look, for me, it's also to do with the fact that we have seen shows with similar, sort of setups in the past. So a community or a bunch of innocent people being held hostage by the American justice system is not something that has the wow factor attached to it in terms of story.
Sure.
Making a Murderer did it. The Night Of was about an Asian person being caught, by the American justice system, and it had a pretty similar trajectory as the one we see in When They See Us. But when you watch the limited series, and I keep thinking of it as a film in my head, so I might refer to it as a film in my head because I really genuinely believe that she's really made a 5-hour film.
Yeah, she has.
And that's the beauty of Netflix, right? Or that's the beauty of the limited series. She could have easily made a 2-hour film about it, but
it wouldn't have had the same kind of impact.
But
that it's having
and
now.
There was so much to say. And I think what Janice and I are going to do for the first time in this episode is that instead of talking about the show as a whole, we feel like When They See Us deserves a sort of an episodic analysis or breakdown, because every episode is a different chapter, and every episode is almost like watching a self-contained film in itself.
So before we go ahead, actually, this is the time when we give you the spoiler warning. If you have not watched When They See Us, this is a good time to maybe go back and listen to some of our other episodes, because we're now going to be deep diving into When They See Us, episode-wise, so which means that there are definitely going to be many spoilers. So let's talk a little bit about what the show is about, right? So the show opens with a group of many, about 30 boys, largely belonging to the African American and the Hispanic community, all of whom are sort of grouping up and heading towards Central Park. Later on in the show, we realize that the term is called wilding, where they're just in the park, all these young boys, and they're just hassling joggers. They're trying to, kind of scare people, cyclists. They're just having a good time, and they're being extremely loud and raucous and sort of, in the, like, basically as what would you think the word wilding means? Well, they're wilding out. What happens on the same night is that a white female jogger is found brutally raped, almost left to die in a corner of the park. Now, please remember that these boys are wilding in one part of the Central Park, and the female white jogger is found in another corner of the park. They're nowhere close to each other. These boys then get arrested. All these 30 boys, at least about a good 15 to 16 of them get arrested for, being a nuisance in a public area.
Right.
Because, people in the people who are in the park and people in the locality start calling up the police and saying, hey, pick up these boys. They're creating a nuisance. They're terrorizing, people who just come for a walk or a jog. So these boys are being held overnight while their parents come to get them. And in the meanwhile, of course, the cops have found the body of a female white jogger. And enter Felicity Huffman, who's been entrusted with the case. And Felicity Huffman's character, what's her name?
Linda Fairstein.
Linda Fairstein is shown as someone who's really, out there looking for sex crimes and looking to solve sex crimes and ensuring that the predators don't get away. So she walks into, the police station where she realizes all these boys were caught in the same park the night before. And instead of investigating the case and figuring out whether they had anything to do with the brutal rape and assault of the female jogger, she immediately starts to put two and two together, saying that, oh, these boys were in the park. This jogger was found in the park. These guys must have something to do with the case.
Yeah.
Right? And so that's where the story really starts to make you feel uncomfortable, because now you're watching many boys. What she says is, she tells all the cops, this is justice for this female white jogger. Go out there and find every boy who was in the park last night. So if there's just 15 to 16 of them right now in the police station, go find all the 30, 40 boys. Pick up more boys if you have to. And you see them essentially going and targeting only the African American community and the Hispanic community, because it's not like white boys are suddenly being brought in, right?
Yeah, so essentially the setting of the show is Harlem. It's basically a bunch of Harlem boys who've gone to Central Park that night. And the show also opens with the 5 major characters. So there is 14-year-old Kevin, and all the 5 main characters are within the age group of 14 to 16. So there's Kevin, there's Raymond, there's Antron, there is Yusef, and there is Corey, who's just turned 16. So he's the only one who, according to the legal age in the US, if he gets tried, he won't be sent to juvenile prison, but would be sent to regular adult prison. So essentially, these 5 are our main protagonists. These 5 are people who don't know each other. I mean, Yusef and Corey are the only 2 characters who had a prior friendship, who essentially joined these guys, these group of boys on that night. And not all of them had the intention of, sort of going there and creating a nuisance or, sort of. So essentially it's like a mob mentality kind of a thing, where if you're innocent and you join a mob and the mob is apprehended, it doesn't really matter what the purpose of your being part of the mob was. Just the fact that you are caught at the spot also makes you sort of part of the crime.
Guilty of the crimes or whatever was happening with them.
So the cops are initially apprehending these men and sending them to family court because they're all kids, wanting their parents to come and sort of, just take them home. But when the Fairstein character, like you said, steps in, she realizes that there might be a possibility that these kids may not just have been there to create nuisance, but among them might also be the actual culprits who raped the woman. And she's not wrong to think the way she does. She's got a really strong conviction to believe that some of these men might be involved in the rape of the woman. But what we watch in the first episode, and like I said earlier, you can break each episode down into a film in itself. This is the episode which is basically crime and interrogation. This is the episode where the crime takes place, the early hours of the crime. Suspects are brought in and the cops begin interrogating. Here's where things get murky. Because Fairstein is already convinced of the fact that some of these boys are responsible for the rape of the woman, they sort of use tactics which are extremely questionable. And like, for example, for 42 hours straight, these kids are not allowed to meet their parents. They're not given any legal advice. They're not allowed to use the bathroom. They're not given any food or water. And essentially you see the similar kind of interrogation you saw on Making a Murderer, where leading questions are asked.
They're slapped around.
They're bombed. They're sort of so they're bombarded with questions, slapped around, and all of those things. Now that's the part of the show that you feel extremely cringy watching, because at the end of the day, it really doesn't matter whether they are black, white, brown. They're essentially 5 kids who are caught in a tight spot and don't know how to get out of it.
What baffles me to this day is that, because of course this is all based on true life incidents, is that it's a true life case. If you go up and read about the Central Park 5, there are enough articles to give you context. What baffles me is that, even when they're showing us the 30 odd boys who are wilding, quote unquote, wilding in Central Park, you can see that there are much older boys, who are sort of the main leaders of this gang, so-called, the ones who are harassing the cyclists. What baffles me is that why would Fairstein go after the youngest of the boys? Because again, 14 to 15...
No, but they were all young boys.
Correct, but I'm saying you can see older boys even in the pictures.
No, it's like the 5 boys that they felt. So they've obviously they've cut out on the fat of that part. We see 30 boys sitting in prison, and then we see that they basically bring it down to 5 kids.
Correct.
Right now, how that process works is not something they've made us privy to it, but I think that's also kind of immaterial, because it's not like the other boys are way older.
Yeah,
they're all in the same age group.
16, 17 age group. And the thing is that, the tactic that you're talking about, the coercion, what happens during the course of this episode is you see 5 boys, actually most of whom aren't connected to each other, knowing nothing about this case, nothing about the female jogger. By the end of the episode, either with the help of the parents, or by slapping them around, or by giving them, giving them candy, like saying that, you'll get to go home if you just do what we ask you to do. You see these 5 boys transform from absolute unknown, we don't know what the hell is going on, to suddenly giving statements that are helping the cops, purely because they've all been told that if you cooperate with us, you can go home.
Yeah.
And it's so well...
Yeah, there's that really heartbreaking scene where the youngest of the lot, Kevin, and that kid who plays Kevin he's just excellent. And he broke my heart because when his sister finally arrives to get him 42 hours later, she finds out that the cops have gotten an illegal confession out of him. And she is asked to sign that confession, which would ensure his release, but at the same time you would also have confessed to a crime you've not committed.
Right.
And she refuses to do that, and the 14-year-old kid just sort of breaks down and begs his sister to sign the form just because he wants to go home. And that is such a relatable sort of a scenario, or if you're 14 and you've taken to the cops, kept there for 40 hours, you are going to do whatever the hell you are asked to do to get out of there.
Yeah, as an adult, I would imagine if I was interrogated in that way and kept there without food and water and bathroom breaks and no familiar face around, I would be dying to go home. Can you imagine what a 14-year-old boy is going through?
Yeah, you're right.
A 14-year-old boy who has no understanding of the legal system, who actually shouldn't even be interrogated without the presence of an adult.
And whose ideas about sex are extremely muddled to begin with, and is being asked questions about penetration and sexually assaulting a woman, which is all extremely inappropriate. Here's what we really need to get at, right, Janice? If the boys had really committed the crime, all right, and when we watch shows like these, or even when we read about it in our lives, that when a rape is committed, we know that emotions run high, right? Not everybody is always thinking in a very logical manner. Whether it's the public, whether it's the media, whether it's the investigators themselves. Now, in Delhi crime, for example, if we compare Felicity Huffman's character to Shefali Shah's, and Shefali does a lot of things to ensure that they make a really quick sort of a catch so that they can ensure that the culprits don't go away too far. Now, if you put that scenario on in what happened with the Central Park 5, is that Felicity Huffman, let's just for a moment assume, had her intentions in the right place. She found a woman who was raped. She knew there were 40 boys or 30 boys around who were creating a ruckus or nuisance, and believed that these 5 boys had actually committed that rape. They would have then done whatever they had to ensure that they got the confessions out of them. Of course, a lot of what they did was questionable, but I am saying what makes When They See Us such a difficult watch is that you are convinced at the very beginning, because that's the take that the filmmaker has taken from the very beginning, and with the fact that you know they are finally going to get exonerated because it's a true story, because you know of the injustice that's meted out to them, you are always with the suspects in the sense that you are in their corner, which makes it a lot more difficult to watch. But I feel that's a very nice sort of complex scenario that is presented to audiences, because I mean, would we be not judging the cops as much in a different show where we were seeing it from the perspective? So in fact, Delhi Crime got a lot of criticism because a lot of people said that it sees the entire show from the cops' perspective, and they up a lot.
No,
right?
I get it. I get it that, the filmmaker's chosen to give you one side of the story, what he or she believes is the absolute truth. But if you had made it from the cop's perspective, maybe the show would have been completely different. I get that. What I'm trying to say over here is, though, that you're showing me from the very beginning the loopholes in the investigation, right? Also, the Delhi crime situation was very different because you did have an eyewitness. From the very beginning.
Let's not make a direct comparison.
I'm not drawing a direct comparison.
I am not talking about anything that's legal in case. I am just talking about intentions.
I'm just saying that when, Felicity Huffman and the cops, Festein's character and the other cops are sitting down and they're realizing that these boys, A, seem to know nothing. They don't even seem to know each other. So how do they get into a rape scenario together? Third, they weren't even anywhere close to the area where it happened, and the timings don't match. The timeline of events don't match. You've realized, even the cops, I think, have realized by this point that we've probably got the wrong
I'm not
guys.
sure about that. Like, you're right. I don't know if the cops have realized it. That's what I'm trying to say here. The legal sides are all right. The facts were all correct, what you're saying, that it always pointed towards the fact that the boys had really not done it. The question is that when cops believe something to be true, and it could be for any reason. See, one is to say that let's frame people, right? I don't think that's what was happening here. They didn't do it with the purpose of framing it. They were wrong and misled. At least that's what I got from the depiction and from whatever interviews of Feinstein I've read later, was that they believed that these boys had done the crime, and because there was not enough evidence to prove it, they started then restructuring and manipulating the evidence, which now, see, we have the benefit of hindsight.
Correct, of course.
Right, so that's what makes true stories so interesting to watch, right? So you now know, because the boys were finally exonerated, that they really f***ed up, and now you can start sort of making judgments and wondering whether was it a racist bent, for example. And I think it all comes down to that. This is not a show about justice and law as much as it's about race.
And what conditioning related to race has done to us.
Yeah, which is why I feel the title is amazing. It's essentially about a white criminal justice system and 5 black suspects who could have or could have not done the crime, but what the first episode of the show shows is that they didn't even get a chance to put their side of the story or get a equal sort of a chance to even circumvent what came their way. I loved the fact that they cast somebody like Felicity Huffman in the case of the prosecutor, because Huffman is somebody who every time Huffman appears on screen, she plays these amazing characters and you tend to always back her, right?
Yeah, she's one of those women that you're always rooting for, the morally upright character, the moral compass of the show in many cases. And so to cast her in this sort of, again, just to agree with what Aniruddha was saying earlier, I get it. I mean, no character, even if they're shown in a villainy light in a show, no character is actually thinking from the perspective of the villain. They're actually thinking that they're doing the right thing. It's just that when you see when you have the benefit of hindsight, which even these cops and the prosecutor did, they still didn't do the right
Yeah.
thing. That's, I think, what the show is really also one aspect of about. That you could have done the right thing even if you realized it 5 years later, but you didn't. You just chose to sort of turn a blind eye and move on with your life.
But that's why we keep hearing these facts about the number of African American people who are sort of spending time in prisons, in American prisons. We keep hearing about the fact that, they are always the first suspect in any crime. Just one last thing. I really liked that one moment in the show, in the first episode, where Felicity Huffman, while making her case as to why these 5 boys should be given a strict sort of treatment, started, giving out numbers and stats about the number of rapes that had taken place in New York that year itself.
Right.
And that kind of struck home because, when Nirbhaya happened, it wasn't just because of Nirbhaya that the conversation began, right? People were just talking about how Delhi is unsafe in general. And to think that New York back in the 80s went through a sort of similar, scrutiny is an interesting thing to learn about. It's not something I knew. But all this and more on the other side of the break, where Janice and I will talk about episodes 2, 3 and 4 of When They See Us.
Hey everybody, welcome to another week on the IVM Podcast Network. If you're not following us on social media, please make sure you do. We're IVM Podcast on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. As I have asked you guys before, if you're finding what you listen to interesting, then please take a screenshot of what you're listening to. Send us a note with it. Tag us on social media. We'll either, talk about it. We'll take the feedback into consideration, or we'll repost it. We just really appreciate getting feedback like that, as do all of our hosts. Also, want to mention the fact that we're still hiring at the best place on earth to work in, which is the IVM Podcast Network. So if you're interested, please do send us an email to careers@indusvox.com. One other thing I wanted to mention, that this is the week of the crossover. We have not 1, not 2, not 3, but 4 crossovers this week on the network. Hosts from one show are showing up on another. And so if you'd like to listen to your favorite host in a different context, stay tuned and find out where they appear. On The Scene and the Unseen, Amit Verma is joined by author Rahul Verma. They talk about the nature of political ideologies and how they hold up in an Indian context. On Advertising is Dead, the successful entrepreneur Ronnie Screwvala joins Varun to talk about being an outsider in the media industry and shares tips for budding entrepreneurs. On Mr. and Mrs. Binge-Watch, Janice and Aniruddha talk about Season 3 of Stranger Things. They go over their favorite Easter eggs, that big plot twist in the finale, and what the future holds for the characters. On Equity Sahiye, we have the co-founder of Motilal Oswal Group himself, Mr. Ramdev Agarwal. He talked to Anupam about his fascinating journey from being a farmer's son in a small village to becoming a successful entrepreneur. This is a conversation well worth checking out. On the Empowering series, Zarina is joined by food blogger Prasen Patel, who is also the host of our Parsi food show Not Just Dhan Saag. Together, they talk about mompreneurs, finding a balance between work and motherhood, helicopter parenting, and more. On Marbles Lost and Found, Zan talks to the musician Nischay Parekh from Parekh and Singh. They talk about Nischay's decision to step away from music for the time being and focus on experiencing new things in life. On Tech Careers in the New, presented by Accenture, Sheila Ditya is joined by Saileja Bhagwatola, Managing Director of Salesforce at Accenture Technology. She talks about the Salesforce ecosystem and Accenture's role in it. On 9XM Soundcast, Eva Bhatt is joined by versatile singer Assis Kaur, who started her musical journey at the age of 5 by singing Gurbani. Assis has lent her voice to famous songs like Bolna from Kapoor and Sons, Tere Bin from Simba, and Ve Mahi from Kesari. And with that, let's get you on with your show.
We are talking about Netflix's big breakaway hit this year. It's called When They See Us. It's been directed by Ava DuVernay. This is Mr. and Mrs. Binge-Watch, and I'm Aniruddha. As we said in the first segment of this show, we are going to be breaking down the entire show into the 4 episodes. And a lot of these shows have a very basic trajectory. There's always the crime, which you open with. So, for example, the first episode of The Night Of was entirely made up of Riz Ahmed driving the girl around.
Sure.
The fact that he was an Uber driver, he was called up to her house, and the crime. The second episode, in this case, the second segment of any such show is always the legal side of it, which is exactly what happens here as well. And this deals with the fact that the 5 kids, 6 months after having stayed in prison, 4 of who have been sent to juvenile prison, and the 5th, Corey, unfortunately, a guy called Corey Weiss, who was just above 16, was sent to regular prison. And it's them coming together with their 5 lawyers, one of who is played by Joshua Jackson, who we saw in The Affair, going up against the prosecution who's headed by the character played by Veera Farmiga. And what's interesting over here is that like Janice said in the first segment, there's not too much evidence tying the kids to the rape to begin with.
There's actually next to no evidence because...
Right. The timeline of their presence in the park is in conflict with the timeline of the rape and when it takes place. Where the boys are found is far away at quite a distance from the place where the rape took place.
None of them seem to know how the rape took place.
They don't seem to have any...
When they're questioned about, how she was attacked, how did they rape her, what did they do, they all had conflicting answers.
Right. So they don't seem to have any material knowledge of how the rape took place. There is no evidence in terms of DNA that is tying them to the assault in any case, in any way. So when you're watching this episode, for the first time after having seen these kids put through that really tough rigmarole and the investigation of the first episode, which like we mentioned was heart-wrenching, you get a glimmer of hope, right? Because you've got this really strong lawyer in Joshua Jackson, even though he's only representing one of the kids. But it looks very clearly, even from the evidence that is presented in court, that there is very little tying these kids to the rape. And you almost start hoping and believing that these kids would be let off.
And yet, from the time the second episode begins, you are sort of led to believe that the cops and the prosecutor and the judge are all convinced that this case is going to be a slam dunk and that these boys are going to end up in prison. And there, of course, from an audience perspective, you're looking at it saying, there's nothing tying these boys except for the fact that they happen to be in the park around the time of the rape. And yet, Vera Farmiga's character, Felicity Huffman's character, the judge, everyone's really confident that they're going to end up on the winning side. But, just to talk about the lawyers, Joshua Jackson, of course, is an actor. We love him in The Affair. We've seen him in a bunch of other roles across shows. He's the only known face, and of course, he's really good. But it's also the other lawyers who really surprised me. The one who's the police inspector turned lawyer, who initially, when he's doing his opening statements, Joshua Jackson has spoken for 5 minutes about how the prosecutors have nothing, how they've just sort of, coerced these kids into giving these confessions. Then there is another lawyer who comes forward and does like a really good sort of, opening statement. And then this police inspector turned lawyer comes and he barely says one line and everyone's looking at him saying, that's it? You're trying to save these boys and their lives and this is all you're going to say? But later, when he has that really great moment where he cross-questions one of the witnesses and gets a really great answer out of him, that's where you're like, welcome to the party. You're finally getting on with the rest of us.
Yeah, so there are a lot of these typical legal tropes that we see in a lot of these shows being applied here. What I really liked about what DuVernay did with the editing of this specific episode is that a lot of times, the basic... outlay of any such sequence is that, the prosecution sort of gives out an opening statement. So you have your character doing that. Then you have this character, depending on whether you are the protagonist as the prosecutor or the defense, you have the second character get up and give this really, sort of great opening statement that hooks you to the case to begin with. And then there is a whole process of, several, attacks and counterattacks and all of those things. And then there's the closing statement. What I loved about what Ava DuVernay did with the opening and the closing statements both is that she edited the prosecution and the defense statements simultaneously.
It's like an intercut, yeah.
And it's beautifully played because every time Vera Farmiga, as the prosecutor, raises a point, you immediately cut to Joshua Jackson sort of nullifying that point
or refuting it, yeah,
from the defense point of view. And I thought that was a really smart editing technique to make something that has been done before and which you watched make it seem slightly more interesting. What I really loved about this episode specifically was that you get to begin to see the support that the boys have started garnering, right? Whether it's in the press, the fact that a lot of black communities have gotten together because they believe that the boys, yet again, there's going to be another miscarriage of justice against them. And she has made use of this beautiful song called Love and Hate,
yeah,
which is when the kids are walking into the courtroom for the first time. And it's like it's a goosebump-inducing moment. And that's what makes Ava DuVernay such a great filmmaker. It's not just to do with the fact that she's picking up subjects that are close to the hearts of African American people. It's the fact that in addition to being a filmmaker who has a conscience, she's also very adept at storytelling itself.
Yeah, I mean,
whether it's a use of sound,
yeah.
whether it's a use of visuals, whether
editing.
just the performances that she gets out of her entire cast. We saw that in Selma and as well. And even in this show, you've got a bunch of 5 really young actors delivering such great performances.
No, that's right, because, Kevin is clearly the standout performer in the first 2 episodes. But I think by the second episode, or by the end of the second episode, you also begin to see Corey really come to life. Because, so just to give, audiences perspective, we didn't talk about this earlier. Corey is the only boy among the 5 who actually wasn't even picked up by the cops. The only reason he ended up at the police station is because he came along with his best friend Yusuf to give him moral support. And then he falls asleep at the police station. So while Yusuf's mother comes and picks him up and takes him back home, there is Corey, who's still lying at the police station and has fallen asleep. And so the cops are looking for like a 5th kid to pin the blame on, to pin the main rape blame on. That's when they find Corey, slap him around and sort of get him to confess.
Right.
Corey, after that, doesn't get much screen time in the second episode, right?
Yeah.
You're really
That's because the case has been divided into 2, like they break the 5 kids up into 2 different cases, and you only need to follow one case, and you just assume that you know what's happening with the second one.
So you were really following the case of Raymond and Yusuf, right? And but towards the end of the episode, the moment that Corey has been given, when you realize in court that he signed a statement that he can't even read, because very early in the show, again, Ava establishes that Corey is, a school dropout, hates going to school, doesn't really believe in education. So he has also been made to sign an illegal statement that he himself can't read. I loved that moment. I think it was one of my favorite moments.
Yeah.
In general, though, Aniruddha, I have to say that I've begun to realize this, that I'm always looking forward to the court proceedings. In most cases, in shows like this which revolve around murder or, true crime or all of this, it's like I'm waiting to see the legal proceedings. For me, those are the episodes that I cherish the most. Yes, the human drama affects me. Yes, the side story affects me. But I love the whole court moments.
I think that's same for everyone, right? Because the legal part of any story, in fact, even if you watch films, all films are structured in such a way that your big finale will happen in court, right? If you have the thrill of a court drama in the first hour and then you go into a human drama, in terms of just flow, you would lose your audience, right?
Sure.
I think everybody looks forward to those legal proceedings because there's so much thrill in it. But I like the fact that Ava DuVernay has the ability to have made the first episode about crime, the second episode about legal, but not make it thrive on those terms alone. It was always a human drama, even while she was dealing with themes that you see on genres that you see on other shows.
Yeah.
Her focus always remained on the human side of the drama.
Sure. And, I also think that's so interesting that she does these really small, subtle things. Like, for example, all the lawyers who've been hired to, fight for the children. Do you see that they're all, from the African American community or from the Hispanic community? I mean, Joshua Jackson is the only white man in a room full of about 15 African American and Hispanic sort of people from that community. And again, it's not like something that's thrust upon us. It's just done very subtly, that even when you're talking about fighting for justice for these kids, it's like, again, it's the community that rallies around them.
Yeah.
It's the lawyers have come from, either they are your friend's friend, like there's a divorce attorney, for example. He's never fought criminal law, but he's clearly close to Yusuf's family, so he takes on the case.
Yeah.
I also love the guy who takes on Kevin's case, because it's so, again, you show that he's from a different part of the community, not necessarily either belonging to, the African American community or from the Hispanic community, but probably from a different part of the world. And yet, fighting. So I'm saying there's a lot of comment on race without it necessarily always being in your face.
Yeah.
There's, of course, the obvious part of it, which is where the children are garnering support from the community. There are protests happening. The media is split. Actually, the media is not split. One of the things that the second episode also shows us is the whitewashing of the media, right? So think back to the 80s and 90s, which is when all your main correspondents who were on TV, whether it was your news anchors, whether it was your reporters, whether it was your editors, they were all probably from the white community.
Right.
So again, conditioning works there as well, right, Ani? Because already the media, again today, in today's day and age, if a case like that were to happen, the media would have 50 angles on the same story.
Yeah.
They would also probably, even though the police is investigating it, probably be investigating the story themselves to find new leads. But again, in the 90s, there was such whitewashing of the media that the minute the cops had come out against these boys and said, these are the guilty ones, nobody bothered to cross-check. Nobody bothered to even check the facts of the matter and to see, was there another rapist in that park?
So on that, I was reading a New York Times article which said that when the Central Park 5 incident took place, America basically hit upon the holy grail of all crimes, which was a black man raping a white woman. So when that happened, it was almost like so that's what I thought made this show really interesting, is that in any such scenario, in any such story, your emotion would always be with the victim. And let's not forget that a crime has been committed. Right? There is a victim who just happens to be a white woman. And there is a beautiful moment in this episode where we actually see the victim for the first time. She comes to court, she gives a testimony. She does not point fingers at any of the 5 boys because she very clearly says that she has no memory of the incident. And you do empathize with her as well. And that's the beauty of a filmmaker like Ava DuVernay, who is so sensitive in her approach to all corners of the story.
Correct.
It's not like just because she wanted her protagonist to seem slightly, for us to be more sympathetic towards them, did she play, say, the prosecution in a bad light?
Correct. At no point does she villainize any of the characters based on their race. But I think the larger message here is we're talking about conditioning. We're talking about where society and circumstances were at that point.
Yeah, and there was a crazy, crazy incident that took place, Janice, which was that Donald Trump brought out an 85,000 USD worth of an ad in a newspaper saying that these 5 boys should be hung.
Yeah, he asked to bring back the death penalty.
The death penalty. Now, can you imagine? Now, this is something I'm really enjoying, right? In a lot of the shows that we are watching, which are set in period dramas and set in America in the 80s and 90s, we watched Loudest Voice recently.
Finally,
is that all these shows and storytellers are finding a way to point to a Trump anecdote from back in the past, almost like this sort of hidden bigot who was slowly and steadily sort of setting the base for everything that he's doing in the world right now. So when you see those two, so two of the parents of the kids have a conversation about Trump, right? It's almost they're so dismissive of him because they would never imagine that 30 years later this man would go on to become president of the United States. And this kind of a analysis can only happen in hindsight. It's beautiful how filmmakers are finding ways to bring Donald Trump, even though an incident took place 30 years ago, you could still make a statement about today's America.
It's like a period show that's making a statement on what's happening in America right now, which is just beautifully done. Also, I mean, the excerpts of the interview that they play when, Yusuf's mother is talking to her friend, which is when they're watching this interview of Donald Trump where he's saying, bring back the death penalty and, these men should be hung and they should pay for their crimes. I mean, again, the gaze also on him is even at that time, kya idiot hai?
Yeah,
like it's not like they're even being neutral about it, which of course is a very big statement that Eva is also making on current America. But moving on to the next episode now.
So just to wrap this episode up, essentially, as we said earlier, even though there's not much evidence implicating them, those statements that were forcefully taken out of them in the first episode, which was the interrogation part of the show, are what eventually nails these boys down, which is a really important point to make, because even in a court case where there's not a lot of material evidence implicating people of a crime, it's that initial statement that was recorded and forcefully gotten out of them by the cops, almost illegal means of eliciting those kind of testimonies, and the fact that these men who were from a sort of lower strata of society, maybe not as educated or insecure, were made to sign on confession forms without having any kind of a legal person going over them is what eventually nails them. And that's just like, it's crazy. It boggles your mind. Even now when you watch it, you just wonder how the hell were these 5 boys sent to prison. But unfortunately, that's what happened. That's where the second episode ends. And then we move on to the third episode, which is about rehabilitation. Now, in any other story, you would move from crime to law to prison and then to rehabilitation. But again, Ava DuVernay uses this beautiful editing technique for storytelling purposes, where she immediately dives into the lives of the four boys who went to juvenile, the four boys apart from Corey Wise, who went to
an adult prison.
To an adult prison, sort of finishing their prison terms at different points of time, and then coming out into a world which is just not prepared for them.
It's really interesting because all you would imagine, you always think that what happens to kids in prison, and when they come out, what kind of human beings are they going to turn out to be? And it's so strange. I think out of the four boys, 3 are sort of true to who they originally started out to be, which also tells you that, maybe the juvie system in America is not as crazy as we think it is. We see the adult prisons all the time and we're like, oh my God, what is going on in there? But in juvie prisons, it seems like these boys come out relatively unharmed or unchanged, but of course not ready for the real world anymore, not ready for how the real world is going to look at them, not ready for the fact that they are now going to be classified as level 3 sex predators, which is not ready for the fact that they have to turn up and show their faces in a police station every 90 days. And it's also about how their families are reacting because so in the case of Antron's family, for example, he's always shown to have this close connection with his father, which of course goes downhill during his trial. And by the time he's come out of prison, he hates his father. He can't stand the fact that his father didn't stand by him and his mother. But
in a show like this, in a story like this, there's always this one character in the family who you track through the course of the story, and that person goes through a real downfall. And in this case, it's Antron's father. Because after he felt so helpless about not being able to help his son, in fact, he advised his son to give that testimony just so that they would let him go. And then that would eventually nailed him. Goes through such a lot of guilt, and that results in him getting terminally ill. And those scenes between father and son are truly, truly heartbreaking. But what's really interesting about that episode is that we find out that those who are convicted with sex crimes, what their lives are like after they come out of prison. So, for example, now Kevin's character was the youngest of the lot, who has already gone to prison for doing something that he doesn't do, has to come out of prison and first go and register at the sex offenders registry, which is like, and there's this beautiful moment with his sister before he goes in, where he says that it's unbelievable that he almost considers not signing up because now he is himself putting that stamp of him being a sex offender on himself. And it shows that episode is extremely crucial for us to see that when justice is not meted out the way it's supposed to, it doesn't just affect the criminals for the time that they're in prison or for the time that they serve their imprisonment. It ruins their life for forever because A, you've not committed a crime, B, the best years of your life has been taken away from you, then you're out, but you're still being viewed by people, and they have been convicted for the worst kind of crime.
Raping and leaving someone for dead.
Yeah, so I mean, like for example, you'll remember there's the character of the Latino guy, Raymond, I think, whose stepmother essentially treats him extremely poorly because she believes that because he was convicted, he really is a rapist.
Or, even the conversation that Raymond's father has with his brother where, the brother turns around and says, how did we end up with a rapist in our family?
Yeah.
Because the truth of the matter is that once you've been sent to prison and once you've been called guilty of a crime, how many of us are going to bother to find out the nitty-gritties of the case or the fact that these boys...
And that is fair.
Yeah, it's fair. Because
that's why courts exist.
Correct. You are thinking that, if the police, if the law, if the judge, if everyone has found these boys guilty, no matter what the reportage might have been, no matter what the overwhelming evidence might have been, the point is once you've been sent to prison, people aren't going to bother to check these facts. They're like, you went to prison, you're guilty, and that too guilty of a crime like rape. It leaves a massive stigma. So I think the entire third episode is sort of dealing with the stigma of like, these boys finally feel like they've come out and now they want to get on with their lives, right? They want to, so Yusuf wants to pursue, wants to sort of learn computers. He wants to study further. He wants to teach. So, and then he's told that, hey, you will never be able to teach because
a
you
level
can't be 3 sex offender cannot be teaching
in the vicinity of kids.
Then, then for example, Raymond's trying to get a job, you see, because he's struggling at home with his, Latina stepmother hating him. The father's paying so many bills. He's struggling to get a job, but literally no one will hire him.
Yeah, but for me, the best scene of the episode was where Yusuf and Kevin are at this sort of community center meeting. It's essentially a support group for convicts who've come out of prison. And there, one of the women who's sort of leading the moderator asks the two men to openly confess to the fact that they committed the rape. Until then, you've seen them very subdued because you've seen them as kids, so they're either scared, petrified, or just completely clueless about what's happening with them. Or till then, you've seen them as adults who are a little subdued as well because they've just come out into this world and don't know what to do about it. They're almost shameful to meet any other person's eyes. And for the first time, the two of them take a stand and they refuse to call themselves sex offenders or rapists, and that because there's a line there where they said that we have maintained throughout that we didn't commit the crime. It's another matter for the court to have convicted us for a crime that they believe which we've committed, but we shall stick to our guns. It doesn't matter if we are being shunned from society. We've already paid our price. And we will continue to stick to the stand that we did not commit that rape. And I think that's a really powerful scene.
Which also tells you again that, these boys have obviously in the interim learnt about their rights. They've sort of, paid a really big price for not knowing what the law is, not knowing what their own rights as minors and now adults are. So it clearly tells you that they've gone through a journey where they know what they have to say, what they haven't got to say, what they've got to do, what they haven't got to do, which is what I feel like this episode largely just focuses on the 4 boys. Yeah. And how they are trying to rehabilitate themselves into society, but easier said than done because really how many of us are willing to accept criminals back into our close circles?
Yeah, which is what brings us to the most heartbreaking, moving, amazing hour of television that I have watched this year, which is episode 4 of When They See Us, which we'll be talking about on the other side of this break.
This is the amazing story of something awesome. Once Chuck decided to start a podcast, and so he did. The end. Okay, that was a crappy story. But I've got some really cool stories over at my new show, The Origin of Things. On this podcast, I look at the stories of how brands came into being and sometimes evolved out of quite unexpected circumstances. And to make it really fun, I reveal the name of the brand and sometimes a category only at the very end. The show is 5 to 7 minutes per episode and perfect for trivia junkies and brand nerds, especially those with short attention spans. New episodes out every Wednesday on IVM Podcast app or website or any podcast app or site that you happen to prefer. End of story, they lived happily ever after.
Welcome back. You're still tuned in to Mr. and Mrs. Binge-Watch, and Aniruddha and I are now going to talk about the best 1 hour of television that you're possibly going to watch this year. If you're already watching When They See Us, and if you haven't reached the 4th episode, we suggest you tune out right now because this episode contains spoilers. And of course, it's also an episode that needs to be experienced and enjoyed on your own.
Yeah.
Don't listen to us give our perspective on it. First watch it for yourself and then maybe come back and revisit this, this part of the show. But this episode focuses on Corey Wise. So Corey Wise is the only boy among the 5 who actually was 16 at the time that he was arrested and tried, which means that unlike the other 4 boys, he was actually sent to adult prison. Oh boy, the ride, the journey that they show us for Corey Wise, played by Jerome, who's also been nominated for an Emmy, right? He's nominated for Best Actor in a Limited Series.
Yeah.
And fantastic. So unlike in the other cases, right? The other 4 boys, when we see them in the first 2 episodes, the actors are different. And when we see them in the 3rd episode, when they've, been released from prison, we see new actors altogether for all 4 of them. In Corey's case, what Ava DuVernay decided to do is that she follows him right from the time he's thrown into adult prison. So she actually didn't change the actor right till the time he comes out, which means that Jarrell Jerome actually has the toughest role out of the 5 because he's literally going through all the beats. He's the one actor who's, literally shown as a minor who's sort of dealing with difficult situations and circumstances, and then also has to portray the role of an adult who is now dealing with the same circumstances in prison. This episode was a really difficult watch. I mean, not a difficult watch from the sense that it made us uncomfortable. It's just it makes you cry because the actor is just so good. For I think 80% of this episode, it's just Jarrell Jerome on screen, in the sense alone, when he's in solitary prison, when he is, sort of cleaning the
hallucinations he's having.
Or the hallucinations and the flashback memories that he's having of all the things he could have done differently, all the memories he could have built with his girlfriend, all the times that, he spent with his sister or brother rather. And, there's just so many beautiful, to carry it all on your own shoulders and just to do it it's almost like a one-man act. Did you feel that while watching this? A large part of this episode 4 of When They See Us, feels like a one-man act. It's like almost theatrical, and yet it's moving. He makes you cry. There's just so much, and yet the story keeps moving. At no point do we lose thread of what is happening and why we're being shown what we're being shown.
Yeah, I was completely blown away by Jarrell Jerome's performance. In fact, like you pointed out, and this was clearly a storytelling choice, which is that you've got 5 kids going to prison, and you make a choice for the sake of volume to not show the lives of the 4 kids in prison, in juvenile detention, in juvenile prison. You just sort of take a leap of about 8 years, 9 years, 12 years, and you essentially cast 2 different actors, right? You cast young boys to play them when they were 14 to 16, and then cast adult actors to play them when they're older. In the case of Corey Weiss, because like you said, she wanted us to go through the prison experience, the casting must have been done sort of backwards, right? So you cast somebody who can pass off as somebody in his mid-20s, but can also look like a really young boy.
Correct.
And that's where Jarrell Jerome sort of sold me on the performance, because when I watched episode 4, I then started thinking back at all the scenes that he performed in the first 3 episodes. And I was completely blown away by the range this guy has. And, at the cost of being repetitive, DuVernay really does treat every episode like a film. And this is like, if this was just 1.5 hour, or it's a 1 hour 20-minute episode, and if this was a feature film, it would still be as heartbreaking and effective as it is in the show. Because like you said, once we move to what happened to Corey Weiss in episode 4, we don't really break out of it for almost an hour. So it doesn't really matter what else is happening in other parts of the story. It's got to do with the fact that even in Indian prisons, we've heard about this, that while there is nothing like a good criminal, there are levels of being a criminal, and being a rapist puts you at the bottommost barrel of the sort of criminal chain.
Sure.
So he is meted out terrible treatment by not just the prison guards and the staff, but the prisoners have that special place in hell, right, for rapists who are convicted. And, I kept thinking about this, and this is so integral to watching the show, is that if these boys were really, were actually, guilty and had performed the rape, would you have watched the entire show with a different prism? Because him being treated the way he is by the other prisoners breaks your heart only because you know the boy is innocent.
Completely. And the thing is that from the beginning of the episode, he's shown to deal with so much, from being beaten up on his first day in prison, from, being with the nurse and trying to beg the nurse for help. And I loved that scene, where he's telling the nurse, help me. Maybe I can talk to a guard. Maybe I can do something. They can't treat me this way. And she looks at him in a really cold manner and says, I'm already helping you by giving you this medicine. Yeah. And it's just delivered in such a cold, robotic, mechanical, steely way. It's almost like you feel like the nurse also already knows that this boy has been sent in here because he's one of the Central 5 rapists.
Yeah, everybody has that prejudice against the boys.
The other thing that got me is like, you're constantly through this episode thinking, ek aadmi ka kitna bad luck ho sakta hai, right? Corey already we know is the guy who wasn't even meant to be in the police station that day. So he's already had a shit run of luck because he wasn't even supposed to be one of the 5 boys.
Yeah.
Then he ends up in adult prison, unlike the other boys, because we know that juvie is obviously going to be softer.
No, and all those 4 boys are in the same vicinity.
Correct.
They know each other.
They know each other. So at least there's this sort of, companionship in knowing that, you have other allies with you.
Yeah.
So those four boys have each other in some sense. Corey has nobody. So, and plus he's a 16-year-old among men who are at the very least
double his size,
double his age. All of them, as they jokingly put it in the episode, waiting with a welcome party to beat him up. The other really touching aspect of this is just like Kevin and Yusuf in the third episode.
Yeah.
It becomes very clear to us that every time Corey is sent in for a parole hearing, the first thing the officers want him to confess is the fact that, do you admit to the crimes?
Yeah. That for me was the most heartbreaking. I think that was the most powerful moment of the show, which is that as compared to the other boys who are now out in the world and have a choice to do either or, you've got a character who's been put through so much f***ing shit that it would feel that his soul has been broken, right? It's not just physical. His soul, his mental well-being, everything is damaged. And then you're put in front of a parole hearing who says that life will become easy for you if you just, sort of confess to your crimes. And he does not do that. And that is obviously a filmmaker's way of telling the audience that that's the level of injustice that was meted out, because it's really difficult for a person who's not guilty to admit to being guilty just because life will become easy for them.
Correct, and especially with a character like Corey, who's shown to be, mostly illiterate, also extremely naive, also someone who's, when I initially saw Corey, I thought he would be the street thug of the 5, the one who's like the street smart, rolling with the, the one who's like
cool crowd.
Yeah. But actually, when they show us his track, he's the most sensitive and emotional of the lot. But even someone as naive as Corey, who will believe an inmate saying, hey, you can ask for a transfer, like it's some chana in the park, would still, he believes in his innocence to such an extent that he will not go and admit his crime, even at the cost of not getting out of prison.
Yeah. So, just a brilliant way how they edited the 4 episodes in such a way that the prison part, which would have in any other film or television show come in the middle of a story, was kept to the end. I think it was a very conscious call to do that, because I believe the filmmaker would have wanted to keep the most hard-hitting part of the drama for the end. And when they see us as the kind of show that keeps you moist-eyed, keeps you with a heavy heart almost throughout the watching of the show. And the 4th episode, I think, is just completely hits it out of the park. We obviously won't tell how it ends, but it leaves you on a really, sort of heavy heart. It leaves you with a heavy heart. And it's the kind of show that makes you question things around you. It's a really powerful piece of storytelling.
In fact, makes you question your privilege in every way.
Yeah.
It's one of those things, like the last time we watched a film called Article 15, which made us in the Indian sort of context question our privilege, right? When we don't pay attention to caste and class issues around us, even in metro cities. This one makes you question your privilege in the sense that just because we have been fortunate enough to live in a society, to live in families and possibly societies where maybe everyday crime doesn't come so close to us, that we don't think about what happens to those who are wrongly implicated. We don't think about their rehabilitation. We don't think about society as a whole and our conditioning and what it's done to us.
Yeah. And it's amazing that we live in a time where a show like When They See Us, which is an extremely intense, difficult, hard watch, is doing such great numbers. In fact, Netflix for the first time released numbers about one of their originals, and it's been viewed by more than 23 million people in the first month of being, which is a big record. And that is special, especially given the genre of the show. It's not like a Stranger Things or a House of Cards, which is a sort of a thriller or easy to watch. It's a show that has garnered a lot of acclaim If you go up on social media, there's a lot of talk happening about it. In fact, Linda Fairstein, who was the character played by Felicity Huffman, has now, over a period of time, she's 72 now, has become this was a very respected figure in the, sort of sex crime unit.
Or some sort of messiah for those,
sex crime unit circle, and went on to write bestsellers. And she's now been dropped from a couple of the NGOs that she was a part of. Penguin has dropped her from their roster of authors. There's a lot of hate coming her way. And, I'm a little divided on this, because while watching the show, I was really, really, really angry towards her character. And I mean, when you're emotional, it's a kind of show that makes you emotional. And I would imagine going out there, and if I ever come across her or see her on social media, I will have the urge to, sort of call her out on it. But it turns out that her life has gone for a complete toss. And
I'm not actually in favor of, a social media mob going after someone. Also,
it's not just social media mob. Even in her social circles, it must be, anyone who's ever thought of her as being this great, sort of criminal prosecutor is now suddenly seeing her as somebody who's racist. It's like, it affects your family, it affects your social circle, it affects everyone. I think the advantage of a show like When They See Us is also the fact that, in a sense, it's trying to set some things that were wrong right. It's trying to bring light to certain people who should be held accountable for the mistakes they've made. Of course, there's no moderation to the kind of reaction that comes in a case like that. But I don't think that's really something that Ava DuVernay or anybody associated with the film should be held responsible for. As long as they've got all their facts right, as long as they're telling a true story, and as long as they're sticking to things as they happened, I think it's this new form of social justice that is being provided through films and television shows.
Yeah, I don't think this is not the first time that we've been told a true story about injustice being done to a certain, upstanding citizen of society. But I'm saying
it happened with Making a Murderer,
correct.
where everybody went up against Manitowoc County. The lawyer who was basically fighting the case against Stephen Avery has been vilified by people on social media, on the news.
Yeah. So I'm saying, but this is a new form of social media and mob justice, because now what's happening is that with social media, we all have a voice. We all have a platform. And it's becoming easier to sort of go against and go after one person. But again, we don't know her circumstance.
But even if we didn't have social media, Janice, and if a show like this had come out 30 years after the incident took place,
I don't think it would be as widespread.
If you have forgotten about...
No,
I'm not talking about widespread. I'm saying Linda Fairstein, who was awarded for several years for the work she did, 30 years later, if a film comes out, it's almost like an expose on her, right? When all the President's Men came out in the 70s, there was no social media at that point of time. But it basically exposed the Watergate scandal in a certain way, right? So anybody who watched All the President's Men had a new sort of response to the Nixon government and had a new opinion about it. So it's not like pop culture can't influence
what I'm trying to tell you
without social media.
Is that because Ava DuVernay has made such a powerful show, and it's of course on one of the biggest platforms in the world now, it gives them an unfair advantage over someone who now cannot really defend her story on the same platform.
No, of course she can defend.
What I'm trying to make an example of is the fact that When They See Us is being viewed around the world.
Yeah.
At best, Fairstein will be able to do a few interviews and press conferences. Right? The level of traction that one will get versus the other is never going to be the same.
The point here is that Linda Fairstein, when she was in 1989 an investigator, had the chance to set things right. She had 15 years after that to do the right things. But she's lived in denial. She stopped, every time she was asked about it, she rubbished it. Even after they were released, even after they were exonerated, because we realized that they were actually not guilty. After 15 years of their life being spent in prisons, she did not change her stance. So it's not like Fairstein did not get enough opportunities to make things right. But now what has happened is that you're right. The only other way to counter this is to now make a story where Firestein is the protagonist and you tell the same, but you can't tell that story because at the end of the day, they did get exonerated. It's matter of public record, which is why I'm saying if this was based on true facts, it would have been different from the fact that it really is a true story. But of course, I mean, these are the kind of discussions and arguments that a great show like When They See Us brings up. It's obviously got 11 nominations at the upcoming Emmys. I really thought that the limited series category was a shoe-in after we watched Chernobyl, which was this great show. But When They See Us is now, I'm feeling such a great competitor to Chernobyl in the various categories at the limited series. It's been nominated in the limited series category. It's been nominated for outstanding lead actor for Jairil Jerome. It's also been nominated for outstanding lead actress, supporting actress, basically the whole cast because they are made of such great actors. Ava DuVernay, of course, has a direction nomination, and she has a writing nomination along with a co-writer, Michael Starbury. We'll be bringing a lot of Emmy action over the next few weeks.
Yeah, the reason we're not getting into our Emmy debate or, talking about who we think might be a stronger contender now versus Chernobyl versus When They See Us, because make no mistake, chances are it's between these two contenders, is because we're going to be doing Emmy episodes in the next few weeks. So stay tuned for that. Just wrapping up the last word on When They See Us. If you, like us, have had this journey of watching these 4 episodes, being moved by these 4 episodes, write into us and tell us whether you share our opinions, whether you have a different opinion on something else. We love hearing from you guys. We love hearing feedback. Tell us what more you want to see on the show, what shows you want us to review, what aspects you want us to talk about. And if you like this podcast, don't forget to check out other interesting podcasts on the IVM network. You can listen to us on the IVM podcast app or on ivmpodcast.com. You can also follow us on our social media handles. We are at IVM Podcast on Twitter and Instagram. And of course, if you want to write into Ani and me personally, you can write into Aniruddha at Ani Guha on Instagram and Twitter, and I'm at JanisEck85 on Instagram and Twitter. Signing off for this week. See you again next week. I'm Janice.
And I'm Aniruddha.
See you next time.
Look! Up in the internet! It's a meme! No! It's a cat video! No! It's the Geek Fruit Podcast!
That's right, we interrupt this riveting broadcast to tell you about our show, The Geek Fruit Podcast, where Tejas, Dinkar and I, Jishnu, talk about everything in pop culture, including DC, Marvel, Star Wars, Netflix, and everything in between.
You know how your friends hate it when you ramble about some nerdy crap and you just want somebody to listen to you? Well, sorry, there's nothing we can do about that, but come listen to us ramble and it'll almost be like the real thing. Kind of.
Listen to new episodes of the Geek Fruit Podcast every Monday and the Geek Fruit Bulletin every Thursday on iTunes, Google Podcasts, the IVM app, or wherever you listen to podcasts. Happy listening, you nerds.
Hi, I'm Ronnie Screwella, first-generation entrepreneur and co-founder at Upgrad. My podcast, Dreaming with Your Eyes Open, is a companion podcast to my best-selling book, Dream with Your Eyes Open. On this podcast, I talked to Amit Doshi, founder of IVM Podcast, about my entrepreneurial journey. I walk you through my successes and failures, mostly my failures, and the lessons that I learned from my experiences, family, and colleagues. What was my first entrepreneurial venture? Why I chose Japanese cartoons over animation cartoons on Hangama? Why did I sell my stake at UTV to Disney? Find out all this and more on the Ronnie Screwella Podcast, Dreaming with Your Eyes Open. New episodes out every Tuesday on the IVM Podcasts app, website, or wherever you listen to podcasts.